I'd like to welcome you to this event. I am Allison Norton, a faculty associate in Migration Studies and Congregational Life. We're going to have a fabulous discussion today on clergy health and well-being. This is the first of a series of lunchtime webinars hosted by Hartford Institute for Religion Research at Hartford International University. So a little about the Institute. For more than 40 years, the Hartford Institute for Religion Research has engaged in rigorous research for religious leaders and faith bodies, anticipating emerging issues and creatively disseminating our findings. Hartford Institute is the only academic research institute in the country that focuses on the organizational reality of congregations. And currently, what we'll be talking about today comes out of our 5-year project exploring the pandemic impact on congregations. And in this work, we are researching, we're collecting and disseminating data all about the changes and the possible long-term implications of COVID-19 on religious life across the U.S. So we're very glad to welcome you here today and invite you to join this conversation on what we're learning, what we're observing, and how these findings may be relevant and useful to you in your work of ministry planning and decision-making. So in this webinar series, I'd like to just highlight that this is the first today of 3 more weekly webinars, 4 total that we'll be hosting over the next few weeks. I'd invite you, if you want to register for the others or check out the other topics we'll be covering, the link is in the chat, so click there to learn more about this series. And after these weekly webinars, we'll be switching to a monthly format, and we'll be offering these the first Thursday of each month during this same lunch time. So I'd like to introduce the presenters here today. They have all worked extensively on this report on clergy health and well-being. This is hot off the press. We just released this report today. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Scott Thumma. He is the principal investigator of this project and the director of Hartford Institute for Religion Research. We also will hear from Dr. Carissa McCoskey. She is a postdoctoral research fellow on this project, and Dr. Brittany Watts, another postdoctoral research fellow, all working on the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations study. I'll just highlight that throughout this presentation, please use the Q&A chat to raise questions, then come up during the course of the presentation, and we will have our Q&A at the end. Before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to Katie O'Leary, the Director of Continuing and Professional Education here at Hartford International University.
Thank you, Dr. Norton. It's good to be in this great room with everyone. The Continuing and Professional Education Initiative is it's a platform. It's really a platform where HIU provides learning opportunities for thriving in a religiously complex world. It's where we highlight things like today's work of the Institute, as well as our centers, programming and events from, say, the Howard Thurman Center for Justice and Transformational Ministry, or the Center for Transformative Spirituality, or the McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. So you can also kind of think of it as a portal. It's a way for non-degree seeking students or even organizations to look to us as a resource. This could be in the form of workshops or trainings, videos, webinars, lots of things. And for you individually, and I think you might be interested in this based on your presence here, auditing is another thing you might want to consider. We have got some fascinating options, and my colleague will throw a link up in the chat. The spring semester starts next week if you're feeling spontaneous, but even if you're not able to pull that off, just take a look at these wonderful, wonderful options, and then maybe that'll encourage you to keep an eye on things even next semester. So thanks for being here.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Scott Thumma, as Allison said, and thank you, Katie. One of our constant challenges here is to talk about the post-pandemic church reality without adding to your depression, maybe also offering a little bit of hope. I think of myself as an optimistic realist. I think churches and clergy are stressed, and that's what we study. But I also think that they have to know what they're facing in order to overcome these obstacles, and I'm ever optimistic about that. So this particular report, which doesn't sound promising with our title, draws upon a nationally representative survey of nearly 1,700 pastors from over 40 denominations. It was done in October, November of 2023. And if you want to take a look at the basic clergy profile from that research, it can be seen in the report that we released today at covidreligionresearch.org. You know, we approached this clergy survey with a desire to understand better what was going on. In the spring of 2023, a survey we did then showed a significant rise in the percentage of pastors who said that they thought about leaving their church, and even more worrisome, leaving the pastoral ministry. As you can see from the slide, 44% thought about leaving their church, and a staggering 53% pondered leaving the pastoral ministry at some point since 2020. Now, bear in mind how often they had these thoughts is pretty critical. And most clergy only had these thoughts once or twice. But those that thought fairly or very often about this now account for 13% of pastors that we surveyed. And these percentages are larger than they were in 2021, but in some ways it's still a small fraction of the country's total religious leadership. And having those thoughts is not the same thing as actually leaving the ministry or leaving one's church. And while there's some overlap in these two thoughts, it's not entirely the same group of leaders considering both leaving their current congregation and the ministry profession altogether. About a third of leaders had both thoughts, about a third had considered one or the other, and the final third had really never considered either of these options. So the really important questions are, why is this happening and what can be done about it? Obviously, our society has suffered considerably over the past few years with the collective trauma of the pandemic, as well as tensions over racial injustice, nationalism, global conflicts, climate change, and all sorts of other unsettling dynamics that directly impact on communal life. But in this post-pandemic context, the importance of faith in pastors' lives and their personal spiritual practices, such as prayer and scripture reading, either stayed the same or increased over the past 3 years for most clergy. Likewise, religious leaders overall appear quite well connected in supportive networks, such as peer groups, or they sought out external guidance and wellness resources. Additionally, the overall health and wellness exhibited by clergy in this study is quite impressive, especially set against this backdrop of pastoral discontentment. We used a version of the Harvard Flourishing Study questions and measured pastoral health at 3 different points in our research efforts so far. While we found a slight decrease in the average scores from 2021 to 2023 on many of these measures, those declines were minimal at best. Likewise, when they were compared to averages from a national sample of Americans from the Flourishing Study, both pre-pandemic and in the summer of 2020, our surveyed clergy scored each of the indexes with roughly a point higher than this comparison group. So based on some of these results, clergy overall look quite mentally healthy and emotionally healthy. But it is also apparent that these health and wellness measures are related to a leader's thoughts about leaving their current congregation or the ministry altogether, as you can see from these 2 graphics. The healthier a pastor is, the less likely they are to consider leaving their church or the pastoral ministry. This is also true for wellness measures. It is interesting, though, that accounting for other factors such as denomination conflict, willingness to change, these health and wellness measures are less significant in explaining clergy discontentment. In other words, it does not appear that a large percentage of clergy have suddenly become unwell or are suffering a dramatic emotional or spiritual disease and then having thoughts of leaving. Rather, there are other significant factors which relate both to thoughts of leaving and wellness. So for a clearer picture, we need to examine the changing contextual reality. The current post-pandemic dynamics are amplified as they act in consort with these long evolving religious developments. It's abundantly clear that in-person attendance has been declining for several decades. Additionally, our faith communities today research shows that attenders, leaders, and their buildings are all getting older. Fewer people from younger generations are now participating. Vitality measures are somewhat down, and greater numbers of members are attending less frequently. But in the midst of the pandemic, we saw an uncommon burst of organizational elasticity that was essential to survive the pandemic. A significant number of congregations said that they were willing to change, as you can see in the summer of 21, the winter of 2021. However, since that point, collectively now churches are less willing to change than they were. And most recently in this fall study, it is some of the lowest figures that we've seen ever about how congregations are willing to change. But pastors know that change has to continue. And this resistance and yet need for change, we think might be part of the discontentment that clergy feel. Generally, morale is diminished, and according to our current survey, 35% of congregations claim that their future looks uncertain. These dynamics are all affecting clergy. So with that brief introduction complete, let me turn to my colleague, Carissa, to look at what some of the factors are that correlate with the thoughts of leaving one's church or the ministry.
So as Scott just mentioned, there is some overlap between thoughts of wanting to leave the ministry and wanting to leave one's current congregation, but there are some distinct differences between the two, so we will discuss them separately. First, we will focus on dynamics related to thoughts of leaving one's current congregation. Interestingly, we only found a few factors which were influential on this decision, and two in particular stood out as most influential. The first one is conflict within the church. The past several years have been full of conflict in several sectors of our society, including churches. In the fall of 2023, nearly 3/4 of congregations reported some kind of disagreement or conflict. We find that the more conflict a congregation experienced, the greater the likelihood the minister would anticipate leaving the placement. Among clergy leaders who have never considered leaving their congregation, the bottom bar in this graph, 40% report no conflict in their congregation, while only 5% of those who fairly often or very often consider leaving, the top bar in this graph, report no conflict. The other dynamic that increased the desire to leave one's congregation is the quality of the relationship between the pastor and the members. In this graph on the left, a greater percent of clergy who report never thinking about leaving their congregation report a very good fit, the orange-colored bar, between them and their congregation than the percent of clergy who have these thoughts often. Similarly, more clergy report a not good or just okay fit with their congregation, the dark blue and green bars, if they often think about leaving the congregation. Similarly, in this graph on the right, we see that a greater percent of clergy report an increase in their sense of closeness to their congregation since the pandemic, the light blue bars, if they have never had thoughts of leaving, while a greater percent of clergy report a decreased sense of closeness, the dark blue, if they often consider leaving. In a sense, both of these primary drivers of thoughts of leaving a congregation, conflict and closeness, are relational. This makes sense as leaders may want to find a congregation where there is a stronger sense of shared ministry, a more supportive atmosphere, a group of people that have a greater willingness to work together, and so on. Having discussed factors leading to thoughts of leaving one's congregation, let us now turn to the more troublesome situation, thoughts of leaving the pastoral ministry altogether. Unfortunately, these thoughts of leaving the profession are more complex and nuanced compared to the thoughts of switching churches. Unlike switching congregations, where a few key factors accounted for most of the dynamic, increased thoughts of leaving the ministry are significantly related to a good many qualities of the clergy in their context. I will talk about these influential factors in three broad categories: demographic factors, job characteristics, and the church context. First, let's examine some demographic characteristics, starting with the age of the clergy leader. Pastors who are in the baby boomer and millennial generations were much more likely to frequently think about quitting ministry. This makes sense for boomers who are nearing retirement age and for millennials who may be reconsidering their vocational choice while still relatively early in their career. Pastors in Generation X, however, thought less often of leaving the profession, perhaps because they felt that they have less freedom to change vocations. Clergy in the silent generation also do not think of quitting the ministry often, as these leaders are likely already serving a church in the midst of their retirement. Some other demographic characteristics have a slight effect on having thoughts of leaving the ministry, but are less impactful than other dynamics, so I will only mention them briefly. We find that African American clergy are slightly less likely to consider a vocational departure, but slightly more likely to consider switching congregations than pastors of other races. Also, female clergy are slightly more likely to indicate that they have thought about leaving the ministry than their male counterparts. However, this is likely due to other underlying factors, namely that women are more likely to be in smaller, older, struggling, and less vital churches. We also find that some job characteristics are important for leaders considering leaving the ministry. For example, a clergy person's employment status in their church is significant. If the leader is full-time, they are more likely to consider leaving the ministry than if they serve part-time. This might be due to the reality that full-time ministry is likely to be all-consuming for these clergy. Issues in ministry might weigh heavier on these full-time leaders than on someone who is only engaged in this work during a portion of their weekly activities. Also, part-time clergy are present in the church for fewer hours and likely have other vocations or tasks that occupy their attention. Additionally, clergy who are solo pastors are much more likely to have increased thoughts of exiting the ministry as compared to clergy who are part of a ministry team with a co-leader or associates. Hand in hand with being part of a ministry team is church size, which is also strongly correlated with ministerial discontent. A pastor is less likely to consider leaving ministry in a larger congregation, a position probably associated with a better salary, a built-in network of relationships, a distributed workload, and the support of additional staff. Conversely, being in a congregation between 51 and 250 weekly worship attenders most highly relates to increased thoughts of leaving the ministry. These placements are most likely to be solo positions and be full-time status, but have the least support and resources. Clergy in the smallest churches have fewer thoughts of quitting the ministry, possibly because over half of the clergy in these congregations are part-time and 2/3 have outside employment. Finally, we also find several congregational contextual characteristics that correlate with the thoughts of leaving the ministry. Denomination family of the congregation is somewhat related to clergy considering leaving the pastoral ministry. Catholic and Orthodox priests were least likely to entertain such thoughts, while mainline Protestant clergy were the most likely. Even though a large percent of evangelical clergy also ponder leaving the ministry, proportionally fewer of them do so in comparison to their mainline peers. Not surprisingly, congregational conflict increased thoughts of leaving the ministry. As we saw earlier when discussing leaving one's current congregation, the more conflict present in a congregation, the greater the likelihood of thoughts about switching vocations. For those clergy who have many thoughts of leaving the ministry, nearly all of their churches are experiencing some kind of conflict. A congregation's willingness to change is also influential on thoughts of leaving the ministry. All congregations had to change to survive the pandemic lockdown period. The significant question facing clergy and attenders now is, are they willing to continue to make alterations to adapt and innovate into the future? Our impression from the data is that most clergy realize this need for continuing adaptation, but this is less true of congregational participants from the perspective of their leaders. This incongruency between clergy and member perceptions has a dramatic effect on the leader's thoughts of leaving pastoral ministry. As seen in this graph, when asked if the church is willing to change to meet new challenges, the clergy who most often consider an exit from pastoral ministry were more likely to disagree, the dark blue and green bars, and clergy who never consider leaving their profession were more likely to agree, the orange and light green bars. Finally, the vitality of the congregation also has a modest effect on clergy's thoughts of ministry departure, but quite a bit less than other dynamics. 20% of pastors who never thought about leaving the pastoral ministry strongly agreed that their church is spiritually vital and alive, compared to just 13% of those who have considered an exit to the ministry. While this is a difference, the effect is only moderate. This indicates that congregational vitality is a reason, but not a primary reason, driving thoughts of leaving the ministry. In sum, our analysis shows that there are different factors underlying these somewhat related but still distinct departure thoughts. The few factors that drive thoughts of leaving their current congregation are more straightforward and contextual in nature, primarily being in a congregation full of conflict or feeling relationally distant from the congregation. On the other hand, there are more dynamics that drive thoughts of wanting to leave the ministry, and it is less cut and dry. We find the same relational factors are influential on this departure thoughts, but so are demographic factors, job characteristics, and a few other congregational dynamics. Now I will turn it over to my colleague Brittany to share some of the voices of the clergy.
With all that you've heard this far in mind, let's now turn to the voices of the clergy, which will help provide a greater insight into their lived experiences as they relate to their role and challenges of ministry. As Scott and Carissa both discussed, there are a number of underlying factors impacting thoughts of departure, like differences among solo clergy and those a part of a ministry team, for instance. One clergy person says, "We lost a full-time clergy position due to the pandemic. I am alone, pedaling a bicycle built for two." Similarly, in response to what is most challenging about ministry, another pastor laments, "Mostly trying to handle every aspect of the church. Since I'm doing most of everything, it means I can never focus on one thing. It's an odd saying, but I feel like butter spread over too much bread." Clergy describes the mounting responsibilities of their role, whether due to changing church dynamics, like loss of leadership, or unmanageable expectations, thus leading to thoughts of departure. Conflict is a significant predictive factor in understanding clergy's thoughts about leaving their congregation or ministry altogether. From the trauma of the pandemic to racial injustice, over the last few years, societal tensions and division have had adverse effects on our social institutions and relationships. In response to the question, what is most challenging about your current ministry, one pastor shares, "My congregation's unwillingness to acknowledge their drive for control and power," largely in response of feeling powerless during the pandemic. It's a huge obstacle in our common life, and it presents itself as lots of conflict over small things that continue to distract us from deeper commitment to the gospel and its call to action in our lives. Though congregations may encounter several types of conflict, there is a shared sentiment among clergy that the tension is hindering the congregation from its Christian call. Although historically, producing change within congregations has always been challenging and a source of conflict, perhaps remnants of the pandemic have had a greater impact on this attitude. Partly, this could be due to the level of change needed by the church to weather the pandemic. Pastors' comments allude to assorted types of conflict because of various forms of change, denominational ties and political leanings, for example. One pastor explains contending with senior leadership concerning what was and what could be. They share, "There's a small group among our leadership who clearly long for the glory days of several decades ago when they were the prestigious downtown church before a denominational split over marriage equality, with a large building, staff, and budget. They want to recreate this model of ministry, and it is not where I feel God is calling us as a church." While most of the congregation agrees, and a few and very vocal folks always bring conversations back to this topic of wanting to approach ministry as a business with growth, as the key metric of success. The open-ended comments shed light on the spectrum of factors influencing clergy's thoughts, including contextual factors mentioned previously, theological differences, lack of supportive structures, insufficient resources, strained internal relationships, challenges sharing a vision for ministry, or unwillingness to change with times. One pastor describes these challenges by comparing them to Numbers chapter 11, when the Israelites complained incessantly to Moses during the Exodus journey about their diet of manna and demanded to eat like they were once in Egypt. This pastor lamented, "The number of older people who are projecting onto me their unprocessed grief at all the changes they have experienced. They complain constantly. No matter what I do, someone will be unhappy. I very much relate to Numbers 11. As you hear, the openness to change or lack thereof significantly contributes to feelings of discontentment. Additional factors like the level of adaptability and vitality of the congregation impact clergy wellness and particularly influence their thoughts of departure from the church and the ministry. Over the years, there has been an increasing percentage of clergy reporting exhaustion and wanting to leave. And in response to what is challenging, one pastor says everything. "I am exhausted. People have moved away from the area and new folks are fewer and farther and slower to engage. Our regular volunteers are tired and overwhelmed. Everyone is reevaluating their commitments. They are less engaged overall and very unwilling to make year-long commitments. Some folks are not interested in even making one-off commitments to engage with community service, participation in worship leadership, or any other volunteer experience at church." Here, the pastor speaks to both the strained commitment of the dutiful few and the lack of engagement writ large from congregants. The pressure and responsibility of doing everything for everyone is a familiar theme, and the decreased engagement and outreach and lack of shared responsibility for worship is wearing on clergy. Another pastor similarly laments feelings of exhaustion, but also questions the current structure and future of ministry. They describe feelings of burnout as they move toward retirement, saying, "I feel like my congregation, like many mainline congregations, I think, looks upon the pastor as a service provider rather than an inspirational leader that empowers them to do ministry. One of my members said she was mad at me for retiring because now who will do her funeral? I think that may be indicative of where the churches are. I feel I am somewhat prophetic in my ministry and preaching, and I think people appreciate it, but I'm not seeing much in terms of a changed lives. I went into ministry hoping to change the direction of our society, but I'm feeling like being in the church may not be the place to do that." The pandemic and other factors have diminished congregational vitality, leading to feelings of discontentment, hopelessness, and exhaustion among clergy. Changing job characteristics, in addition to contextual congregational shifts, such as conflict, unwillingness to change, and lack of vitality, are clearly impacting clergy lived experiences today. And I'll turn it back to Scott.
Well, thank you, Brittany. I was right about being depressed. So you've heard some of the challenges and the factors that contribute to this clergy discontentment. And some of these powerful voices that we saw in the open-ended questions. So then the question is, so what can be done to remedy some of this? Now, it's obviously based on what we've seen and presented, a really complex contextual dynamic. There's no easy answers. Both the problem and the solution are found in the dynamic between the religious leader and the congregational members. Diminishing conflict, developing better clergy-congregation relations, realizing the need for change and beginning to reinstate some of that change, among a number of other factors, are I think some ways to begin. It's apparent in our research that, as this slide shows, that an increasing sense of closeness between the pastor and the congregation does lead to diminished thoughts of leaving. As you can see, those that had increased levels of closeness over the last couple of years are much more likely to have no thoughts of leaving or few thoughts of leaving, and that shifts as the closeness between the pastor and the congregation have diminished over time. In many ways, the pandemic was a collective trauma, both for clergy and for the church. Both of them suffered, and I think our research is showing that both of them collectively together are responsible for overcoming some of these challenges that lead to pastors thinking about changing congregations or leaving the ministry. But in fact, leaving the ministry or leaving a particular church isn't going to allay the difficulties or resolve the unprocessed grief or loss or depression, or the depression that clergy seem to feel about failing one's calling. I think it really is a solution that both need to participate in. It must be a kind of collective solution, one that does not rest solely on the backs of clergy or on the decisions to think about departing either the church or the ministry. It relies on the collaboration and healthy relationships between both groups. But it also requires, I think, based on what we're seeing in the data, a hopefulness that the future could be better, that it could be bright. A positive outlook regarding the future of the congregation significantly corresponds to fewer thoughts about switching churches or leaving the pastoral ministry, as you can see from these two graphics. If a congregation feels like it's thriving into the future, or it's struggling but it's hopeful, or it's okay and it's going to be into the future, those congregations are much less likely to have clergy who have thought about leaving or switching to another church. Therefore, the rosier the church's outlook of the future, the brighter the clergy person's thoughts regarding ministry. It's impossible to know which dynamic came first, but clearly the church context and the clergy person's ministerial outlook are intertwined for good or for ill. And therefore, I think that also indicates that the solution to some of this is also intertwined between the two entities. Therefore, it kind of goes without saying that the healthier the healthier the clergy are, the more resilient they'll be, but also the healthier the congregational dynamics in terms of lack of conflict or willingness to adapt or positive relationships with the leadership, the less likely clergy are to have thoughts of departure. And this is happening in many of the churches in the study that we did. And it could happen with others, I think, with just a little more intentionality. So let me leave you with words of encouragement from several of these pastors, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A and some conversation. One pastor says, I thrive on teaching, preaching, training, and helping members grow spiritually. I'm enlivened when I see a few members understanding, embracing, and living out our mission and vision in the church. Another says, the congregation is very committed and really works well together. We have lost several key members to death, and we're not replacing them as well or as quickly as we might. Nevertheless, God has been with us through it all and will continue to be with us. As a young pastor, another one says, I'm truly loving what I'm doing, and the people are responding overwhelmingly positively to the new and creative ministry ideas. So you can see, even in these comments, that it isn't the clergy person or the congregation. It's really the collaboration of both.
And that's just a good chance to kind of wrap up and invite all of you to continue to follow us. We have a whole bunch of upcoming and recent past reports on research and this project. So please go to our website, covidreligionresearch.org. But we also will invite you, please complete the feedback form in the chat, because this is a chance for you to kind of speak into and inform some of our future directions. So we have a place there for you to record your thoughts on what you would like us to research into the future, what would be useful to you and in your setting and context. So thanks for being with us here today. And I hope this is not the last time that we will see you. We do have 3 more webinars coming up over the next couple of Thursdays. So please register for those if you have not already, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all very much for coming.